This is your PowerPoint for your PowerPoint quiz on the Roaring Twenties. During the 1920s, after World War I, the GNP, or Gross National Product, decreased and unemployment increased. This was largely due to the decreased war demand and was a typical effect after any war is done. However, once the economy got over this, there was a quick rebound due to new technologies and products. For example, Henry Ford's assembly line ended up producing one car every 90 seconds on average. Electricity became more widespread to suburban neighborhoods. A.P. Giannini created the Bank of America, which introduced personal checking and savings accounts. What was really important was the move into suburbanization and new household items like refrigerators that became commonplace in these houses. The radio was created and made private in America and then widespread to people's homes. The significance of all of this was that people felt like they had achieved the American dream of moving into the middle class. Suburbanization was probably one of the most important effects of this increased economic boom. There was an increase of people moving from urban centers into suburban neighborhoods. This had a psychological shift in the way people felt about how they achieved the middle class and the American dream. Remember, the people moving into this were immigrants, especially the descendants of the new immigrants from the late 1800s. They felt that they had finally made it in society. This was best symbolized by the use of new household items like irons, washing machines, central heating, and the car. What this demonstrates also is the economic impact of increased consumption power. The stock market saw increases for several reasons. One, there was mergers between companies that increased the allowance for the pooling of resources. Mergers began to interlock with differing types of markets so that a car company could merge with real estate. Buying on the margin allowed common people to get into the market. They would put 10% down on a share of stock and then borrow the rest, or 90%, in order to buy that share of stock. Holding companies were created in order to pool shares of stocks together and manage them. These economic changes led to massive cultural changes as well. Parents who had more money in the middle class began to send their children to boarding schools. These boarding schools created a youth culture that redefined children according to age development. Now there was a group called teenagers that had its own defined needs and desires. One of these desires led to a freer understanding of youth autonomy or individual freedom and sexuality. For example, at boarding schools, children often had parties called petting parties. Also, the car allowed for children to travel to other cities to meet other children and to do other types of activities. In this youth culture, music and dance became a major form of expression. For example, jazz and swing music became a rebellion against traditional forms of music. The traditional forms of music were typically based on math, order, and harmony. This was classical and traditional music. Swing and jazz are based upon the values of improvisation, creativity, individuality, and rapid change. Also, dance movements require little clothing and quick movements. So this reflected new sexual attitudes and a sexual revolution about body movement and space. This then affected beliefs about gender as well. The flapper girls at this time period challenged the traditional beliefs on femininity, which were based on the private-public distinction. The idea here is known as the gender binary, the idea being that men and women biologically retain different parts of society. The private sector is known as the household, which was safe and nurturing and therefore seen as feminine. The public sector, government or business, is seen as part of the social jungle of aggression and competition and therefore seen as male. Flapper girls bridged that gap by doing public activities usually reserved for men. For example, they wore shorter hair, they danced in public, they smoked cigarettes, and they sat with their legs crossed. These may seem like very small things, but they were direct challenges to the overall cultural norms of the gender binary and what a woman was supposed to be like. It's not that flapper girls were doing all these things to intentionally challenge that ideology, but by them doing these things, they ended up challenging that ideology. All of this led to a general youth culture that was developed in the 1920s about this ideal of youth culture. The youth were symbolized as innovative, progressive, and competitive. For example, in the sports world, Babe Ruth was a sports symbol when he was a young man because he had overcome alcoholism in order to succeed. Charles Lindbergh, also seen as a youth symbol, had flown the Spirit of St. Louis on the first transatlantic voyage from New York to Paris without refueling. All of these examples demonstrate this new youth culture that was based upon risk-taking and individualism. African Americans also experienced a dramatic cultural shift as well. African Americans began moving out of the South in what was called the Great Migration. They moved during the 19-teens up until the 1970s from the South to northern cities. They developed something called the New Generation in Harlem. The New Generation stressed the importance of multiple aspects to African American identity. They criticized racism, but they also criticized African American leaders like W.B. Du Bois for limiting black identity to just politics. The New Generation stressed music, art, poetry, and drama, and wanted to expand the black identity into all aspects of the human experience. There was also a group of people in literature called the Lost Generation, who criticized this period as one stuck in materialist conformity. They included the authors Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, William Faulkner, and Sinclair Lewis. This literature argued that individuals needed to risk and be more individualistic and break out of the norm of suburban material reality and the desire to just achieve and have consumption power. Hollywood at this time developed into numerous different types of markets. For example, the Technicolor Corporation provided color movies for the first time in 1927. Talkies were created with pictures having a soundtrack. And the cost of movies was reduced to about 5 cents for a showing. Movies were constantly battling, though, with the challenges of cultural norms and self-censorship, especially on the issues of nudity and language. What's important about all of this is the demonstration that now middle-class America could afford to go to movies. For them, psychologically, this was like the upper class going out at night to Broadway. But there were reactions against all of these major changes. These were known as traditional reactions. Fundamentalist religious groups reacted to the cultural changes, criticizing what was called modernism. Modernism is the belief that science, secularism, or non-religion, rationality, and individuality are the purpose to progress in society. Traditionalists stress faith, religion, wisdom, and the community for the purpose of order and stability. Traditionalist religious leaders criticize the new looser beliefs, especially on sex, gender, and the respect or disrespect of elders. Some examples of these traditional reactions are under traditional reactions number 2. The best example is the Scopes monkey trial. John Scopes was a public school teacher in Tennessee, and he was recruited by the ACLU to teach evolution in the public school in order to challenge local laws that said that you were not allowed to teach this subject matter. This violated the Tennessee law against doing so. The case was eventually taken to court, with Clarence Darrow arguing for free speech, while William Jennings Bryan argued for the traditional education of the young. Darrow at one point called Bryan to the stand in a surprising move that is usually not done between lawyers, and he criticized his belief in a literal interpretation of the Bible. Bryan won in court, but he lost in the public perception. Another example of traditional reactions on the most extreme end was the rise of the KKK, or Ku Klux Klan, to a more national scale. The Ku Klux Klan had existed long before, after the Civil War, but their main target had been African Americans. They now broadened their goals and vision and criticized the new immigrants as well as un-American. It eventually led to their successful passage of the Emergency Quotas Act. This act made immigration based upon a percentage of the amount of people coming in 1873. This effectively limited the number of Eastern and Southern Europeans and Japanese into the country, since not that many were coming into the country back during that time period. The KKK was so successful that they were able to do a massive march in Washington, D.C. against immigration. This demonstrated the strength of Southern racism and the ability for the KKK to now become nationalized. During the 1920s, the overall politics became one of laissez-faire. Progressivism had ended, and the 3 major presidents at the time, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, moved away from that back to a notion of laissez-faire economics. Their main policy was to reduce taxes, especially on the top income earners, in order to drive the economy. The government was also suspected at this time period of major scandals. For example, the Teapot Dome scandal, which revealed that the government officials had taken bribes to sell off oil land in Wyoming. This only led to further distrust on the effectiveness of government and the desire to limit government action. Also at this time period, there was a huge scare in the government of the recent success of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Attorney Justice Palmer began the first Red Scare in 1920 with a roundup of supposed communists and anarchists. One of the best examples of this is the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italian immigrants who were accused of murdering a guard and a woman in Massachusetts. They were shown in court for being anarchists, and this eventually led to their conviction and their eventual execution. However, years later, it turned out that the evidence was largely circumstantial for at least one of these individuals. The question was whether the case's final outcome was based more upon prejudice towards immigrants and a fear of communism from Eastern Europe. However, during the 1920s, there were underlying inequalities. Wages had increased by 11%. Corporate profits had increased by 65%. 70% of families only made $2,500 per year, and 80% of families lacked significant savings. How is this possible given that wages had increased by so much? The reason why was because wages increased from 1921 until 1924. Then they began to stagnate. From 1924 to 1928, wages did not rise at the same level as inflation. In 1926, companies had begun to stop providing an increase in jobs. This led to the first major crash of the stock market on October 24, 1929, with a second crash that took place on October 29, 1929, ending the huge economic boom that had taken place for most of the 1920s.